Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Is this a good quality outcome evaluation report? My name is Susan Howley and I'm the Program Manager for the Center for Victim Research. The Center is built on a partnership between the Justice Research and Statistics Association, the Urban Institute, and the National Center for Victims of Crime. The Center's mission is to serve as a one-stop resource for victim service providers and researchers to connect and share knowledge to increase access to victim research and data and the utility of research and data collection to victim service providers nationwide. This webinar and the Center for Victims of Crime are both supported with funding from the Office for Victims of Crime, Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. Research and evaluation can't be useful to practitioners who don't have any context for what we're reading. Today's speaker is going to help us with that. Stan Orchowsky is Senior Research Fellow here at the Justice Research and Statistics Association and a partner on the Center for Victim Research. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Stan.
To talk a little bit about how to understand, hi everyone. These are our objectives for today. We're going to talk about how to understand key evaluation terms and evaluation designs and how to recognize the components of a well-written evaluation report. We're going to start with what is outcome evaluation, and there's a definition there. It's a systematic and objective process for determining the impact of a program, a policy, or some other intervention. We're specifically going to look at the issue of whether or not the program has achieved its goals and objectives, and hopefully, if it hasn't, some insight into why it hasn't. And one of the keys here is trying to determine whether observed outcomes are actually due to the program that we're trying to evaluate and not to other factors. And that's a key element of evaluation design. And then beyond the scope of today's webinar, but a question of interest is whether or not the program or policy is cost effective. So we're going to look at just a brief overview. We're focused on the right-hand side here, which is outcome impact, but generally speaking, folks talk about two different kinds of evaluation, process and outcome. Process evaluation is focused on program implementation, so looking at whether or not the program carried out the activities that were planned. So for example, if you have a program model and it says we're going to provide 6 treatment sessions, the question is, did most people receive all 6 treatment sessions? And so that would be an example of a process kind of a question. The outcome evaluation, on the other hand, looks at the impact or the results of the program. So looking at the goals and objectives, whether or not it actually achieved those things. When we talk a bit about assessing change, most evaluations really focus on or get down to this idea of assessing change over time. And there are basically 2 ways to do this in evaluation design. The first is comparison to a null condition. In other words, comparing people who participate in the program with people who don't participate in the program. And then the second way to do it is comparison to a previous condition. Basically, this is what most of you are familiar with, I'm sure, this sort of pre-post idea, comparing people who participate in the program after they participate with themselves prior to their participation in the program. So in both cases, what we're trying to do is compare, observe differences in outcomes and try to figure out whether or not those differences that we observe are actually due to the effects of the program. So when we talk about being due to the effects of the program, what we're really talking about is establishing causality. That is, did the program cause the results that we see? And here you see listed some of the elements of causality. And the one that we're particularly concerned with in terms of evaluation design is the third one, the third bullet down there. The effect was not caused by an outside factor. So what we're trying to do here is make sure that when we say the results that we see are caused by the program, we want to make sure that there are no other outside factors that could explain those observed results. Now, what kinds of outside factors are we talking about here? Well, a fancier name for these outside factors is plausible rival hypotheses. And what we're talking about here is something that could reasonably account for the observed differences between the program participants and the non-participants that rivals our hypothesis. And our hypothesis, of course, is that it's the program that's produced these differences. So what are other reasonable explanations for observed for the effects that we observe other than the program or the policy that's being evaluated? Well, there are many, many, many possible outside factors, but there are some that are more readily identifiable. And so these general classes are listed here. So, for example, changes outside of the program that would affect most of the participants, such as policy, procedure, or administrative changes. So let's imagine, for example, in the middle of the program, we somehow change the criteria for who's allowed to participate in the program. Or we have a bunch of certified therapists and they all leave over the course of the program. And now we have people delivering the program that haven't been certified. So these are examples of these kinds of changes that can affect the observed outcomes. Local national events is another example. So imagine if we were in the midst of an evaluation of a community policing initiative in Minneapolis last summer when Justine Damon was shot and killed by Officer Noor. What would that do to our evaluation? Or any of those kinds of outside events that might happen either at the national level or at the local level that might change things. Another ready example is developmental changes, particularly in children, but really any change that's associated with the passage of time. For example, if we're studying trauma, how much of observed change from before to after the program in individuals is due to the program and how much is simply due to the passage of time after the event occurred. So all of those things are these sort of outside influences. Another one is measurement error, which is simply the changes associated with the measures you're using rather than being the true change that's associated with the program. So for example, if you're using some kind of achievement test or competency test or something like that, then most folks are going to score higher the second time than they would the first time, regardless of any kind of intervention or program. And these kinds of changes that I've been talking about are often associated with this pre-post idea. So the idea of giving some kind of a test at the beginning or measurement at the beginning, doing the program, and then some kind of measurement at the end. So another set of outside factors that are plausible rival hypotheses are associated with the participants themselves. So for example, if we were to recruit a particular kind of participants, so low-risk participants, for example, or participants with high resilience, then we would be likely to see change anyway, regardless of whether or not we intervene. For example, if we have low-risk offenders and we're looking at recidivism. Or if we're selecting participants the opposite way, if we're selecting them because of an extreme behavior or an extreme need or something like that, then we would expect to see changes just over the course of normal time and measurement and so forth, regardless of whether or not we actually intervene with a particular program. Now, as opposed to the pre-post, these kinds of outside factors are often associated with comparison group designs where we're comparing the people who receive the program with another group of people who haven't. So, what do we do about this? Well, the best answer, by far, is the randomized controlled trial, which I'm sure you've heard tons about. We begin with a group of individuals who are eligible to participate in the program. We select some to participate and some to not participate, and those are our experimental and control groups, but we do this selection in a completely random manner. And then we compare the outcomes for the two groups. So what is this? How does this do how does this accomplish the control of these rival hypotheses? Well, basically what it does is the randomization means that the two groups will be equal with regard to these influences. So the outside factors will be experienced equally by the two groups. Individuals, due to any kind of biases and how we selected people, will tend to cancel each other out because they'll be equal in the two groups. Obviously, if outcomes are more positive for the program participants, then we conclude that the program is effective or that it actually caused the observed changes. These RCTs are often also referred to as experimental designs. We have more and more obviously examples of these, but the most famous one that you might be familiar with is Larry Sherman's experiment on policing domestic violence in the early 1980s, where police officer responses to misdemeanor domestic violence and incidents were randomly assigned to like sort of a do-nothing group, a mediate, arbitrate group, or an arrest group. So while that's a great answer, there are some problems with implementing randomized controlled trials. First of all, many interventions simply don't allow for random assignment. So you can't assign, for example, people to randomly be victims of a crime and other people to not be victims of a crime. And there are many, many other attributes that people have that we're interested in studying that simply can't be randomly assigned. In addition, withholding promising treatments may be considered unethical, illegal, or unfair. And in addition, it's hard to get decision makers, people who are responsible for deciding who goes into programs and who doesn't, so for example judges, to say, well, we're not going to let you do that, we're going to decide who goes into the program. Some people don't like that authority being usurped. So if we have a situation where we can't really randomly assign folks, what can we do? Well, there's a few things we can do. First of all, we can employ what's known as a quasi-experimental design. And all that means is that we've somehow managed to control for some of the plausible rival hypotheses of interest. So for example, one very common quasi-experimental design is an interrupted time series design. Where you have a large number of observations that occur before an intervention or treatment, then you have the intervention or treatment, and then you have a number of observations that occur after that. And what you're looking for is a shift in that series of measures. So if you could imagine, for example, a community-based sexual assault prevention campaign, and you can look at sexual assault rates on a monthly basis in the community for several years prior to the campaign, and then look at monthly rates for a few years after the campaign. And if the campaign was effective, you should see a shift in those rates. And so that kind of a design controls for some of the known PRHs associated with some of these weaker designs. Another way of trying to control for these is to use an equivalent comparison group. And in this case, we haven't done random assignment, but we do have a group of people to compare, and we think that they're similar in many ways to the people who actually receive the program. Obviously here the problem is figuring out whether the two groups are in fact equivalent. And the issue is we're never quite sure what all of the factors are that might be different between the two groups that could be related to the program outcomes and that could be plausible rival hypotheses. So this becomes very tricky. One good way to do this is looking at a waiting list design. So if we exploit the fact that a program has a limited capacity and has sort of an overflow, then the people who are on that waiting list presumably have met all the criteria for the program and would be in the program if the program had more capacity. So we can be fairly certain that they're similar to the people who are in the program. This, of course, doesn't work if we're taking people into the program based on some set of criteria like the most severe need. So that's probably the best way to use this equivalent comparison group design. This can also be added to a pre-post design, and that kind of bolsters both of them because the weaknesses of each are kind of helped by the other. And there are many, many other more complex designs, but we don't have the time to get into all of those. The other thing that we can do here is control for differences between the groups that occur after the fact, and by using statistical analyses. And again, that's a topic that we for another time. Okay, so what does this all mean for an evaluation report and trying to read an evaluation report? Well, the reason all this is important is because this determines how good this evaluation is going to be. So how well designed is it? How solidly designed it? So as you're looking at evaluation reports, you can think about, for example, did the evaluation use an experimental design? And let's look at the no column first. So we can think about why not, first of all. And this is not an easy thing to know, but there are some areas of criminal justice and where randomized controlled trials have been done plenty of times, and they become sort of the norm. I'm thinking particularly about drug courts, for example. So when you have one of those areas, if you know you have one of those areas, and you see a study that's not an RCT, you got to wonder why. And you have to, think about maybe giving that a little bit less weight. So when the answer is no, you have to think about, first of all, was it a possibility? And I don't mean, somebody said we couldn't do this, but was it a possibility from a design perspective? Was it possible to randomly assign people? It's not always possible, as I said earlier. And if it was possible, is there an explanation for why it wasn't done? And then thinking about how did the evaluation measure change? Was it a pre-post kind of a comparison? Was it a comparison group? Was it a quasi-experimental design? What did they look at? And how did they do that measurement? If there was random assignment, then we have to think about, did the random assignment occur as planned? And I can tell you that often it does not. More times probably than not, it does not. So there should be a description in there of where did things kind of go wrong. So in the Sherman study that I alluded to earlier, the famous domestic violence arrest study, you have many patrol officers who simply didn't do the random assignment for a variety of reasons, and you had just a very few officers who accounted for a relatively large percentage of the random assignments. So that wasn't the plan. So so how, thinking about did it occur as planned, and if it didn't, how does that affect the sort of validity of the evaluation? And then what's being done with the control group? I'm sure most of you know that the control group, when you have a control group, it doesn't mean you don't do anything at all with them, because there are all kinds of effects that we know that are associated with just being part of a study. So you have to think about what actually was happening with the folks who were in the control group. We know that they didn't receive the program, but what did we do with them? And then, regardless, thinking about what are kind of the plausible rival hypotheses as you read through this, what could some of the outside factors have been? What else could have caused the observed differences other than the program? And presumably, if it's a good article, the authors have told you this. You don't have to figure it out for yourself. And then what, if anything, was done to control for these outside factors? So before we move on, I want to just pause for a moment and see if there are any questions. And if you have questions, just type them on into the chat box.
All right, I don't see any questions yet. Remember, that chat box is in the bottom right-hand corner, and we encourage any of you to ask questions while we have Dr. Orchowsky's attention. All right, I'll let you get back to it, and I'll interrupt you if any questions come in.
All right, thank you. So what we're going to do now is take a look at a few specific examples. And we're going to work through these, and these are actual reports. I put the references in there for you. I've tried to use their terminology as much as possible. So if you see things in here and you're wondering why is it worded this way, it's because that's the way it was worded in the articles. And so the first one is a sexual assault prevention evaluation study. So this looked at excuse me, an evaluation of an on-campus sexual assault resistance program that consisted of 4 3-hour units, and you can see what these units were all about. Okay, so knowing no more than you know just from that description, we have our first kind of poll question for you. Take a look at these alternatives and tell me what you think a solid design for this evaluation might look like. It's not necessarily the perfect design, it's just the best design. Okay, we're watching the poll numbers coming in. Thank you. Okay, thank you. We're going to close that out. Sorry for those of you who are slower readers. Okay, so it looks like B, right, is the most popular answer. Most of you saying that, and then C, followed by very few of you saying A or D. So you're a pretty smart group. What's wrong with A, among other things, is you simply just don't have anything to compare the result to. So you could do that, but you would have no idea of if you found 10% or 20% or 30%, you would have no idea if that was a little or a lot. D, requiring everybody who has had previous experience is problematic because those two groups end up being very different from each other. And we really don't know what the implications of that difference are, but we certainly know that they're different from each other. Now, B, that's fine. That certainly would work. That's a very common approach. There's two issues with that. One is sort of an issue that you may or may not have talked about. I mean, that's fine if you want to test knowledge, but a better approach for an outcome measure, I think, would be actual behavior. So if we're supposed to be designing a prevention program, did we actually prevent the behavior that we're trying to prevent? Now, obviously, there are a number of issues associated with that are outside the control of the program, but still, that would be. But the bigger issue in terms of what we've been talking about so far is that this is your classic pre-post design with no control at all. So the problem with this is all of those other external factors that may influence the outcomes, and you don't know what those external factors are, and so that's why that becomes a very weak design. C, however, is actually the best of these possibilities. I mean, this is basically the A through J is not obviously a random, but it's close to random. It's not completely random, but unless there's a reason to believe that people with the letters whose names start with the letters A through J are different from those whose names start with the rest of the alphabet, that's essentially a random assignment. And then giving those people the program, giving the rest of the people, not giving the rest of the people the program, and then seeing how they compare is really kind of the best approach to this design. And in fact, that's what this evaluation did. So this is sort of a simple depiction of that. So you have this whole group of incoming fresh women on the left, and via random assignment, some number of them are assigned to the prevention program, and some number of them are assigned to a group that receives a brochure about sexual assault, which in fact was what was currently being done on these particular college campuses with incoming freshman girls. Let's look at a second design, a different kind of a study. This is a study treating PTSD and sexual assault survivors, and it's evaluation particularly of a new method of dealing with this called cognitive processing therapy. So as you can see, it's designed to treat PTSD, and it consists of these two components. And in fact, there is what you might call a gold standard out there, at least at the time the study was done, which was a while ago now, called prolonged exposure. And so part of the goal here is to look at the effect of this new approach compared with the other approach. So if we look at how that was designed, the reason I liked and picked this example is this is more of a clinically oriented kind of a study. So we're not just evaluating the new CPT curriculum or approach compared with a control group, but we're also evaluating it against what might be called the current gold standard, which is this PE approach. So what that means is that the evaluation randomly assigned sexual assault survivors to one of these three categories. So either to the new CPT, to the standard PE approach, or to what they call a minimal attention approach, which also was a wait list. And so I'll talk a little bit as we go through the rest of the presentation what was done with that wait list, because I thought that was a nice example of how to deal with that. The third study was an evaluation of a specialized domestic violence unit in a police department. And you can read that. I'll give you 1 second here to read that description. So you can see that this unit is designed specifically to handle the most serious cases, and there's a specific definition there defined in terms of event lethality, while every other case is given to the patrol units, which is the standard approach for dealing with these cases in this department. So we're going to take a moment and do our next quiz, and it's the same question as before. What would a solid design for this evaluation look like? A, randomly assigned DV cases to either this specialized DV unit or to patrol. B, randomly assigned DV cases to either the DV unit, patrol unit, or to a no response condition where officers do not respond to the call for service. C, assign all DV cases to patrol for their first domestic violence call, then to the DV unit for second and subsequent calls involving the same victim and perpetrator. And D, compare outcomes for cases that are assigned to the DV unit during the normal course of operations and use statistical techniques to correct for any group differences after the fact. So go ahead and cast your vote for A, B, C, or D. All right, thank you. We're going to close that out. So looking at these results, it looks like most folks selected A. and then next was C, and then relatively, well, and then D, and then the least was B. So don't complain about this. This is a little bit of a tricky kind of a quiz. Let's start with D, with B, which people did not care for. Obviously, not responding to a call for service is probably not a good idea if you're a police department, probably illegal and unethical, so that's the problem with B. C, assigning DV cases to patrol for the first call and then the DV unit for second and subsequent calls, that would be okay, except for that's not the purpose of the unit. If you read the stated purpose, the stated purpose was based on lethality, and so doing that means that what we're not doing is whatever the unit is designed to do. Okay, and then A, which was by far the most popular choice, randomly assign DV cases to either the unit or patrol. That would certainly work from a design perspective. The tricky part of this question is that's simply not the purpose of the program. It's not what the program does. The unit is designed to handle the most serious cases. The most serious cases are specifically defined in terms of lethality. So randomly assigning cases would change the nature of the intervention. And you really can't do that. You can't really change the nature of the intervention as much as you would like to. So, although it seems like not a great solution, in fact, probably the best solution and the one that was used in this evaluation was D, comparing outcomes for cases that are assigned to the DV unit during the normal course of operations. Now, so this is an example, and the reason I picked this was because this is an example where cases are given to either the domestic violence unit or to patrol, which is the standard operating procedure. There is no random assignment here. So we know that there's going to be big differences between these two groups, okay? And we're going to have to deal with that some way. There's just no way around it. If we're going to do this evaluation and we're going to take this program on the terms that it exists in, and we're just going to have to deal with the fact that there are differences. And we will have to judge at the end whether or not they did a good job of controlling for these differences statistically. Okay, before we move away from design, are there any questions?
Yes, we did have one question, and that is, do you know how often are randomized controlled trials used in victim-related research?
Not very often at all. Not very often at all. And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, they're not often used in criminal justice, period. And if there are actually a number of efforts underway now to increase their use in criminal justice. It becomes, I think, particularly difficult. So if you think about these examples that I'm showing you, so you think about and what I said earlier about the idea of certain sort of topics, areas of intervention sort of lend themselves more than others. So you can see it's relatively straightforward. If you've got a bunch of college freshmen and you're trying to look at a curriculum, it'd be pretty easy to just randomly assign to one or the other. And the same thing with a more clinically based study like the Ptsd intervention. But when you have something like the one that's up on the screen now, it's just simply impossible. And so a lot of what we're studying is that kind of thing. It's a specific intervention or reaction to a particular problem, and it's set up a certain way. Now, certainly you could randomly assign cases in this design. You could just do this to see if some other kind of intervention other than what you normally do is more effective, and that's essentially what the arrest study was. But in fact, if this is already set up this way, it becomes much more difficult. So it's really just a kind of a real world problem. Some things lend themselves to it more than others, and I think that in general, I think it's probably true that evaluation in this area is behind, shall we say, evaluations in some other areas of justice. that then in general, and then the use of RCTs in particular. All right, so let's move along. So we want to look at, I think, a little bit about other things to look for as we're reading through these evaluation studies, and the next thing is the actual sample itself. So looking at who was studied, particularly some of these issues, was the sample representative of all individuals? And so what I would encourage you to do is think about who is in the sample. Who are they studying? What part of the country are they in? What part of the world are they in? What's their makeup in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of socioeconomic status, and so forth? Are they typical of the folks who require this kind of service or receive this kind of service? And then for your purposes, for those of you who are practitioners, are they similar to the people in my program? Because that's really what you want to know when you're assessing this evaluation. You want to know, well, will these findings apply to my folks? Is this something I should implement? So how similar are they to the folks in your program is important. And then this question of, you might start out with a sample that looks pretty good, but by the end of the evaluation, it doesn't look so good anymore. So the sample might start out representative, but end up non-representative. So one of the big issues here is dropout, which is inevitable in most evaluation studies. But the question is, who's dropping out of the study and why? Particularly, is the dropout related to the program, or are some kinds of people more likely to drop out than others, so that what we end up with is a sample that's not representative? And then, of course, the question of how many were studied. So the sample size needs to be big enough so that we can detect differences between our groups, but very large samples will conclude that differences are statistically significant when in fact they're not. So these are just descriptions from these studies. I'm going to try to run through these fast because I'm getting nervous that the time is already running out. The Sexual Assault Prevention Program, these were first-year female students in 3 universities in Canada. I believe it was the western part of Canada, as I recall. And it's nice to have the time period in there, too, so you know what you're dealing with, because the lag between the time an evaluation gets done and the time it gets published in a journal, for example, can be many years. So in thinking about that, how representative is that group of, for example, female students in U.S. universities, in larger universities, and smaller universities? These are all things that need to be considered, because we're not sure if the findings will be generalizable to your specific context or to another specific context. Almost 70% of them were recruited through psych classes. Psych class research participant pools. If any of you remember Intro Psych, you were encouraged or forced to sign up for these things and be part of experiments. So the question here would be, are the people who take psych classes representative of everybody else, of the other, fresh women and other women on campus? And then the rest were recruited through a variety of ways. And again, that maybe knowing the percent of people who were reached might be of interest, and so forth. So this comes straight from the article, and I like it because it's nice when you have these kind of charts that show you the dropout in these evaluations. It's unusual for a journal to spend a whole of its precious pages on something like this. So what I want to call your attention to is a couple of different things. But first, take a look at this, and let's do a little one of those raise your hand things like we promised. And tell me look at the bottom there, the 2 boxes at the bottom, and tell me if you think this sample the final sample ended up being representative of all of the fresh women who entered at those 3 universities. Just give me what are we doing? Like a raise your hand if you say yes. How about that? Raise your hand if you think it was representative. Okay, some of you do. Most of you do not. And I suspect that the reason that most of you do not is because of this enormous drop-off rate. So if you look at the box on the right, you can see that if we start with 3,241, 2,300 were excluded, mostly because they declined to participate. So that's almost half. And so you have to ask yourself first, in terms of representativeness, are women who decline to participate in something like this different from women who agree to participate? And so that's your first, and you can see the vast majority have dropped out because of that. And then you know, after that we have a variety of reasons, you know, of people not meeting eligibility criteria, withdrawing, failing to show up for follow-ups, and there's sort of typical attrition reasons in something like this. But one of the things that happens is that by the end, by my calculation, it's about 28% of the whole group that they started with who was eligible, who end up in the study. So there are, I think, you know, we don't know for sure if they are representative. There are some ways that we could figure that out. For example, if we have some characteristics of that 3,241 that we start with, some demographic characteristics, for example, we can compare our sample that we ended up with to the group that we started with on those things, and at least see if they're similar on those limited numbers of factors. But of course, there are untold and unknown many factors that they might be different on. The cognitive processing therapy study I wanted to put in here because I just thought it was kind of interesting. This being a more clinical kind of study, all of the different ways that people can drop out of this. So to begin with, we start with this idea of 267 eligible women, but not everybody meets the criteria for PTSD, and that's what we're trying to address here. So the biggest, out of these 5 bullets that you see here, the biggest reason that that women were excluded were because they didn't meet the criteria for PTSD. And hopefully we'll have time, we'll come around to that point. But and then you have all these other things. So you have people who don't complete the initial assessment. And then you have, as the course of the evaluation goes on, you have new things happening. So re-victimization's happening to people that causes them to not be eligible for the study anymore. So they have to drop out. And then you have people who just drop out during the course of things. So what you end up with is something that looks very different from what you started with. Now, there are a couple of really nice things that they did here, and those are shown in these last 2 bullets. One, they tell you what the dropout rates were for the 2 treatment groups, and they tell you that they're similar. And then the other thing they do is they tell you that for some of their measures, particularly the PTSD and the depression scores, that the people who dropped out and those who completed weren't different. And so the reason they're telling you this is because they're trying to demonstrate that the ultimate sample is in fact representative, and that that the 2 groups are similar to each other, and that they didn't drop out at different rates and so forth. So my question for you here that you can vote yes or no on is, do you think that this sample is large enough to actually show group differences if they were to be there? So why don't we do this? Why don't you raise your hand if you say no, this sample was not large enough to detect group differences? Oh, okay. So y'all just don't like to raise your hands, I guess. All right, so I think that so many of you raised your hands, but many of you did not. It's very difficult to assess this in this context without getting into greater detail about what the measures were and how many measures there were, and in fact, what we would expect the difference is to be if this new CPT therapy were in fact more effective, how big a difference would we expect there to be between this group and the other treatment group and then the control group? So I would say that probably the right answer in this case is it's just really hard to figure out if this sample is large enough. But clearly, there's significant attrition here, although we can question, in fact, whether 267 is the right number to start with, because a lot of those women don't meet the criteria for PTSD in the first place. Our third example here from the domestic violence unit, we'll just run through this quickly. So this is one, the reason I like this is because this does something rare in evaluation research. It actually does a random sample from a larger group. So we have this group of almost 6,900 complaints, and we're going to randomly sample 1,000 cases from that. Normally, like in these other two examples, you didn't see that random sampling from a larger population happening, and that's what really determines representativeness, is the ability to be able to do that. So, so that's one thing. And then the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting is that because they wanted, wanted to compare domestic violence unit cases to regular patrol cases, and because domestic violence unit cases only actually take up 8% of the entire number of domestic violence cases that are handled, they have to oversample these these unit cases, and in this case they triple sampled, as they say, which means they took 3 times the number that you would normally find, and so they end up with 255, which is enough to compare. And then finally, a number of the cases involve multiple victims and multiple offenders, and so they drop them out, and so you end up with 891. Are there any questions about selection before we move on? Obviously, I'm just skimming the surface on each of these topics. All right, let's think about implementation here. And we want to make sure that the intervention was delivered to the targeted participants. Often it's the case that programs need to fill slots, and sometimes they end up taking participants who either weren't eligible or who don't meet the criteria. One of the things I liked about that CPT study that I showed you earlier was that they did a really nice, they screened out the women who didn't show symptoms of PTSD rather than just assuming that everybody who's a victim of sexual assault in fact is experiencing symptoms of PTSD. So I think that's an important kind of a thing, because the program is targeted only to PTSD symptoms. And if they had put those other people in, they would have been getting all kinds of spurious results. So I like that. That is an example. Then the idea of dosage, or how much of the program are you getting? Are you getting the whole program? So ideally, the idea of program needs to be precisely defined. What is it that we expect to produce the desired outcomes? And if we have less than that, whatever that is, then we shouldn't expect to see the outcomes. And so, for example, in the sexual assault prevention study, the actual criterion for inclusion in the study was being able to attend 1 session. And if you recall, there were 4 3-hour sessions, and each of them dealt with something different. So if the criterion is only 1, then the question is, well, are they getting enough dosage if they only go to 1? So if we actually look for how these were written up, and here's the example. So you can see one of the things that they talked about in the article was that 91% of their participants attended 3 or all 4 units. And that's fine, and that's great, that sounds good. The problem comes in if it was 90% who attended 3 and 1% that attended all 4. So it raises, it makes me a little suspicious about why they combine them. And the point is, if 3 units are sufficient, then 3 units is a better and more economical approach. These are a couple other things they mentioned about the sample that I like, because they introduced some other concepts like crossovers, which simply means that when you have a comparison group or a control group and an experimental group, you want everybody going to the right group. So you don't want the control people accidentally or on purpose going to the experimental group and receiving the treatment when you thought they didn't. So they're saying there's none of that. And then what they refer to as cross-contamination, you want to make sure that there's no information sharing between the two groups. So if you have a freshman girl who's in the SAP group and her roommate is in the control group, but she's telling her roommate all about everything she's doing, then her roommate is acquiring information that she shouldn't be acquiring. And so, you can decide if 10% or 14% is actual little cross-contamination or not. But and this is just a description of the cognitive processing therapy approach. And the reason I like this was because at the end it illustrates in that third bullet that the weight group folks were once the 6-week, which was the length of the treatment period, was over, those weight group folks were then assigned to either of the two treatment conditions. So that's the appropriate way for using a weighting group and convincing people that you should be able to do an RCT is you say, well, we're not withholding treatment, we're only withholding treatment for 6 weeks. And then after that, those people are, after we do our assessment, then those people are going to receive their treatment. So it's sort of a delaying. All right, we're going to move on to measurement. The way you define your outcomes and how you measure them is obviously critical, particularly in cases where the outcomes being measured are psychological constructs such as the depression or PTSD or so forth. When we can, those measures should be valid and reliable instruments, and choosing the appropriate follow-up period is also critical. Too short and you won't be able to see the effects. Too long and the effects will have begun to deteriorate. And then the question of what kind of data we're missing and why and how was that handled. There's a lot of reasons that data might be missing. If there are multiple follow-ups, as we saw in some of these examples, then people might miss entire testing sessions. Sometimes people don't answer specific questions. They don't fill out specific instruments. Sometimes there's a minimum number of responses that are needed for an instrument to be valid, and they haven't answered enough questions out of that. So the key thing here is that the article or the report should tell you what we're missing and what data we're missing and how that was handled. And that should seem reasonable. So just a couple of examples here. So this is a form that's actually being used. I don't know this particular form, but presumably it's been used in other studies and has some sort of validation of it. And then in terms of how the outcomes are being measured, we're looking at 12 months of follow-up, and we're looking at classification into one of these 5 categories. Again, this is language straight from the report. And in fact, what they decided to do was only look at completions and not at anything else. And so I gave away the answer to the next quiz. So let's just skip on right past that. Sorry about that. I knew I was going to do that. Okay, now the cognitive processing therapy, again, this is more of a clinical study, so we're looking at a bunch of different psychological constructs. The only reason I listed them in here is to just make that point to you that these are all validated scales that are widely used, I believe, and so it's a completely different kind of outcome construct than than just looking at the percent of completed sexual assaults, or what we would see in the third example, which is just the percent of repeat domestic violence victimizations. Yes, question.
Yes, in talking about implementation, how does it affect the measurement or the implementation when you have a program that may have multiple components and the provision of those components is based on the client needs, but the client doesn't actually need all of the components that you're testing? How does that affect the evaluation?
It depends on what you have in place for figuring that out. So if you have multiple components and you have an assessment of need or of risk, then you know that you do at the outset, then you know what the client needs, and you can, that the ideal that we're all shooting for here is matching the need with the services, right? So if you have a way of assessing that, so that this person is tracked in the appropriate place, then and this would be all part of the process piece of the evaluation. So you'd want to know, is there like a procedure in place for figuring that out so that we understand who goes where and who receives what kind of services? Is that based on, and then we can look and track and say, all right, well, did we have the instrument? How did the instrument score people? Did people all tend to fall into one category? Did they fall into multiple categories equally? Did they actually receive the services that they needed? And does the outcomes seem to correspond to that ability to match? So that, ideally, that's the way you go. If you have a bunch of components sitting out there and nobody's using them, or they don't seem to be producing anything, then you're wasting effort. And so, that's not a good thing. So yeah, that would all be part of a process evaluation. Okay, let's look at analysis really quickly. What you want to look for here is what statistical tests were used, did the report explain why those particular ones were chosen, and how large were the effects observed. So this idea of, there's a difference between statistically significant and practically in the real world significant. Now I know when we asked, a number of you said you were interested in statistical analysis. This is really well beyond our capability to get into here. JRSA has a series of webinars on its website on statistical analysis that I would refer you to. But let's just take a look at this in very general terms and what we're trying to do. So this harkens back, for those of you may be get flashbacks to your graduate stats class or your undergraduate stats class. What we're trying to do is determine how likely it is that anything that we observe, any effect, any difference, is due to chance alone. So the point that I want to get across here that's really, and if you recall, this is the null hypothesis, and the idea that there's no difference between the groups is the null hypothesis, and we want to reject the null hypothesis, and that's what tells us that our program is effective. And that what I want to get across is the idea that the statistical significance depends on these three elements. And one of them is the size of the effect, that is, the difference between the two groups. So obviously, the bigger that difference is, the more confident we are that a difference that big couldn't be due to chance, okay? But the other element is the sample size. Now, the larger the sample size, the more confident we are that the sample represents the population. So we're also more confident that that difference is not due to chance. So if you think about the way those two things are related, the larger the difference that exists, the smaller the sample size is going to need to be for us to detect that difference. Conversely, the smaller the difference, the larger the sample size is going to need to be. But it's also true that very large samples will mean that very small differences will be statistically significant. So that's where we have to think about, is this practically significant as well as statistically significant? And then level of confidence, or that alpha level, you may recall, is just something that will tell us what proportion of the time is this difference of this size due to chance alone, and by sort of tradition that is set at 0.05 normally, and there's a null hypothesis of no treatment effect, which is that the difference size is 0. So that's sort of the general strategy, and I've just put in the examples again straight from these articles. So sexual assault prevention, as I said, they're looking at the 1-year incidence of completed sexual assaults compared to the group that received the SAP training and the control group, and there's the difference, 5.2 versus 9.8. And that P is actually the alpha level. It's a probability level that is computed by statistical software packages, so that you don't. Back in the old days, you had to go to the back of the statistics book and look at all those tables. You may recall those tables. Now the computer packages just print the exact value for you. So what that's telling you is that only 2 times out of 100 would that difference between 5.2 and 9.8 be due to chance alone. And since that 0.02 is less than 0.05, we would reject the null hypothesis and conclude, in fact, that the sexual assault prevention program was effective in reducing completed sexual assaults. Now, I put the second bullet in here because this is a New England Journal of Medicine article, and this is a concept that we're not going to talk about, but it's known as the number needed to treat. It's a epidemiological, medical kind of concept, and it's got a formula associated with it that we're not going to get into. But the reason I put it in here is because it's their attempt at the journal level to say, we understand that, you know, these p-values and these differences, it's hard to put that into context. So here's a concept that says for every 22 women who took the program, we would prevent 1 additional rape. So it gives us a sense of, practically speaking, how important is a difference of this size. So, you know, think about this then. If we look at that, if we think about that third example, the domestic violence police unit, specialized police unit, and so and think about an outcome measure that says we're looking at perpetrators who you know are in the specialized unit, and we're looking at subsequent incidents of domestic violence over some follow-up period. What kind of a percentage between those groups would be different? You know, would you consider to be important? Would it be 10% difference? Would it be 20% difference? Would it be 30% difference? How big would you consider big in terms of an outcome like that? Well, if we look at the actual study, the comparison group, the ones who were handled by patrol, 37% had at least 1 future domestic violence incident. And if we look at the other group, that number was 29%. Now, again, you have to keep in mind that these are completely different groups of people, and so we're going to try to control for that later on with the statistics, and we're not going to get into that. But I just wanted to show you this because this is another very simple statement in the second bullet. That is that little x squared is actually a chi, so it's chi squared is a chi-squared statistic, which is used to tell the difference between 2 variables that are frequencies or counts. That p-value of 0.03 is that computed alpha level. So again, since that's less than 0.05, this suggests that you know, despite being at a greater risk for recidivism, these more severe offenders had a lower offending prevalence in the future, suggesting that the unit was in fact effective to the tune of 8%. Okay, so let's just look, so that in terms of article evaluation, there's always a discussion section. What are we looking for? We're looking for, are they going to explain their results within the context of previous research and evaluations, which I almost always do? Do the conclusions match the reported results? In other words, are they, let's make sure they're not over-concluding based on the results they found. Are weaknesses in the evaluation explained so that you don't, all these kinds of things that we've been talking about for the last hour? And then are the implications for policy and programs discussed? So if we look at some examples, excuse me. So this is just straight out of the articles. Previous studies, so this is why it's important, showed limited effectiveness of other interventions for women. So this is why we're doing this. Here's how our program that we're testing differs from other programs in the past. So it explains why we might be finding that this is more effective than others. So these are the reasons why we expect this to work, which is very important, particularly in our business. It's important to know why we think we might have gotten the results that we got. And then what are the limitations? Well, you know, it's looking only at women. It's looking at, it's suggesting that women in the SAP group may have underreported any assaults that they had, thinking that they should have learned this avoidance behavior and so forth and so on. And then the question of are findings applicable to settings other than college? Again, keep in mind that these are their limitations that they discussed. You and I could probably think of some others. If we look at the CPT, they point out that they went to great pains to make sure that their sample, that they excluded people, and if you remember there were 5 exclusion criteria, that they excluded people that normally would be excluded in these kinds of populations, so that their sample should really generalize nicely to the kinds of trauma populations that you're working with. They try to make the case that dropout rates were typical of PTSD rape treatment samples. I don't know. And then I like this point because dismantling studies is an interesting term, but basically what we're saying all the time, and this kind of relates to Susan's question earlier, is what are the components? What's inside the black box that might be causing these findings? We need to dismantle these different effects, and is it this exposure piece of this? Is it the cognitive therapy piece? Is it both? And so forth. And then again, this idea of matching clients with therapies in order to get outcomes. So I like the way they dealt with that discussion. This third thing comes from the DV unit, and the reason I put this in, and you can read this as I'm talking, I like this because the results weren't as dramatic as you might hope, I think, even though we understand that there were pretty big differences between those groups. And so they acknowledge that, and they talk about the fact that they're just looking at one little piece of the system. They're not looking at the prosecution, and they're not looking at the courts. And so so I thought that was, you know, kind of an interesting way to look at that. Okay, if you have questions, type them in now and I will address them, but I just wanted to end with this sort of one idea, which is, if this is all beyond you, it all seems like too much, then you can just leave it to the experts. And the experts are, these days, people who are doing systematic reviews like the Campbell Collaborative and like the briefs that Urban is in the process of doing for our CVR project. Meta-analyses, which are statistical methods that are used to summarize lots and lots and lots of evaluation findings and try to draw conclusions about effect sizes based on them, or the What Works websites like crimesolutions.gov, NREP, or the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. All of these kinds of approaches are folks who are experts in this, who have read the evaluation studies for you and have determined what they tell you. And so in most cases you will find, like for example in crimesolutions.gov, you will find an emphasis on randomized control trials and on quasi-experimental designs. You will find, you know, very simple ratings, check marks, and so forth of whether the research or the evaluation literature has shown these things to be effective. And what it does is it means that if you're just looking for like well, what do I do? What will work with my group of people? What could I try in terms of my program? Instead of reading individual evaluation reports, you can read these sort of summaries where other folks have read the individual evaluation reports for you and have tried to synthesize and summarize what they show with regard to your particular group of people.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Orchowsky. If we can launch the poll while people take a moment to type their questions in the chat box. We'd really like to know your reactions to today's session. So please take a moment and give us your thoughts, how you thought the webinar went today. And meanwhile, remember that chat box is open in the bottom right, and this is your opportunity. I know Dr. Orchowsky covered an awful lot of things. I, for one, feel much smarter and much better able to make my way through an outcome evaluation report. If there are still some areas that you'd like some clarification on, please go ahead and enter your question in the chat box below. And for those of you who are waiting for someone else to go first and ask a question, if you can take a minute and answer that poll about today's webinar. And also while we're waiting, I want to remind you, as some of you may have noticed in the chat box, that if you do have questions coming up on reading through outcome evaluation reports or other questions related to applying research and data to your work, remember that the Center for Victim Research offers technical assistance. You can send a request for assistance to cvr@urban.org. That's cvr@urban.org, and we'll try to provide you the assistance you need. Okay, I am not seeing any questions come through the chat box. If we miss any of your questions, we will be sure to respond to those when we send out a link to the recording. Dr. Orchowsky, I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the audience before we close?
No, everybody have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
All right, goodbye, everybody.